In the late summer of 1944, as American forces pushed eastward from the breakout at Normandy, they believed the worst was behind them. The hedgerows had been brutal, the bocage claustrophobic, but nothing in France prepared them for what waited on the edge of Germany. The first real shock came not from a sudden German counterattack, but from something far quieter, the sense that the enemy had vanished into the landscape itself. Patrols advancing toward the Siegfried Line reported seeing nothing, no helmets glinting in the sun, no movements between the trees. Yet every time a squad moved forward, a single rifle shot cracked from somewhere unseen, or a burst of MG-42 fire raked the ground in front of their boots. The men of the 1st Infantry Division began whispering that the Germans were not simply defending, they were disappearing. Feldgrau, the gray-green uniform of the Wehrmacht, blended perfectly with the dark fir forests and shadowed ravines along the German frontier. In fading light, a motionless German sentry could look like a stump, a bush, a crease in the hillside. Some positions used chicken wire and branches to build shapes indistinguishable from the forest floor. American officers ordered their men to stay alert, but alertness meant little when the human eye simply could not separate cloth from nature. As September turned to October, the Americans pushed into the outskirts of Aachen, the first major German city they would fight for in the war. Here, the camouflage shifted from forest craft to urban deception. German infantry positioned in shattered buildings wore Feldgrau, the exact tone of the dust-coated rubble. They moved only when artillery strikes masked their footsteps. When they fired, it was often from a loophole cut into a darkened room, impossible to identify at distance. Tank crews rolling Shermans down narrow streets felt as though they were staring at empty windows that could hide anything, rifles, machine guns, or worse. Every shadow was suspicious, every silence dangerous. But the real shock would come from the forest south of the city, the place that would become infamous, the Hurtgen. Within those dense stands of pine, the Germans perfected a kind of invisibility that Americans had never imagined. Foxholes were dug beneath tangled roots, concealing not just a man, but whole fire teams. Camouflage nets draped with real branches changed color with the seasons. White smocks in early winter made German grenadiers indistinguishable from the falling snow. Men in the 4th Infantry Division reported advancing within 15 yards of a German outpost before realizing it existed, and by then, the firing had already begun. Mortar tubes hidden beneath log piles fired and disappeared before counterfire could be arranged. Even the legendary American artillery struggled because there were simply no visible targets. For soldiers used to fighting with clear lines of sight, this new battlefield felt alien, suffocating. Veteran sergeants began telling newcomers to stop looking for men and start looking for shapes. A patch of darkness, too regular, a bush that had no roots, a glint of metal that did not belong. Yet even this advice often failed in the face of German discipline. The Wehrmacht had spent years perfecting camouflage training, whereas the U.S. Army had emphasized mobility, firepower, and combined arms, not concealment. But camouflage alone was not what broke American momentum. It was what the camouflage allowed the Germans to do, control the range of the fight. Every town and forest seemed designed to funnel Americans into kill zones, where German soldiers waited with Panzerfausts, rifles, and machine guns. Unlike the open fields of France, here the enemy fought at distances so short they felt personal. In October, in Aachen, a Sherman platoon turned a corner and saw nothing but empty street. Seconds later, 2 Panzerfausts streaked from a second-floor window, so well camouflaged it might as well have been painted directly onto the wall. In Hurtgen, German squads lay silent until Americans were within 20 meters, then unleashed fire from 3 directions. Survivors often said they had no memory of seeing the Germans, only the flashes. It was here on the German border that American forces first faced the realization that this was not a war of sweeping maneuvers anymore. It was a war of 30 meters, then 20 meters, and soon far less. Yet in these early encounters, they did not yet know how to fight this kind of war. Infantrymen advanced in standard intervals of 10 yards, unaware that the Germans wanted them closer, much closer. Officers ordered frontal attacks on fixed positions, whose exact shape and location they could not see. Tank crews trusted their armor, only to discover that at 20 meters, even a single Panzerfaust could punch through with catastrophic effect. What unnerved the Americans most was not just being ambushed, but realizing they could not even detect the setup of an ambush. The Germans dictated range, timing, visibility, and direction. The battlefield had shrunk from hundreds of yards in France to the space between two trees in Hurtgen or between two windows in Aachen. And until the Americans learned to shrink their own tactics to match it, the Wehrmacht would continue to strike from ghosts in the forest and shadows in the ruins. This was the beginning of a harsh education, one that would force the U.S. Army to rethink every assumption it had carried into Germany and rebuild its close combat doctrine from the ground up. The first time American tank crews truly understood what a Panzerfaust could do was in the narrow, dust-coated streets on the western edge of Aachen. A Sherman from the 745th Tank Battalion rolled past a collapsed storefront, its commander scanning the windows at second-floor height, searching for a silhouette, a muzzle flash, anything. But the building in front of him looked dead. Shadows swallowed the interior, plaster dust coated the brickwork, and a jagged curtain of rubble tilted into the street like a broken jaw. It seemed empty, the kind of ruin that had no life left inside it. Then the wall blossomed into fire. A Panzerfaust burst from a slit so expertly camouflaged that even the infantrymen walking beside the tank had not noticed it. At 20 meters, the warhead did not miss. It slammed into the Sherman's glacis plate and punched through with a shriek of molten metal. The tank lurched, smoke filling the turret as the loader screamed for daylight. The street erupted into chaos. German grenadiers hidden in basement firing ports and behind overturned furniture poured small arms fire into the infantry platoon escorting the tanks. Several Americans tried to flank the building but ran headlong into a second ambush, this one from a doorway so dark it looked like part of the rubble. The trap had been planned carefully. Multiple Panzerfaust teams waiting until the tanks committed fully to the street, letting them roll just close enough that escape was impossible. That was the secret of the Panzerfaust, not just its power, but the way it forced the battle into a narrow envelope where the Germans controlled every meter. In the Hurtgen forest, the effect was even more devastating. Unlike the tight geometry of city streets, the forest offered a maze of stumps, logs, trenches, and ravines where a man could hide a weapon the size of a broom handle and remain invisible until he chose to strike. American engineers clearing trails for Shermans often advanced only 5 minutes ahead of the tanks. They cut wires, detonated mines, and marked safe routes with white tape. But no amount of preparation could find every hollow tree, every foxhole carved under the roots of a spruce, every log pile covering a German firing position. Panzerfaust gunners, grenadiers barely 20 years old, waited in absolute silence as the American armor crawled forward. They were instructed to hold fire until the tanks were no more than 30 meters away. Many waited until 20, some until 10. At that range, a Sherman seemed enormous, a shaking wall of steel whose engine noise drowned the forest. But to the Germans, this was the perfect distance. Impossible for the tank commander to scan both flanks at once, impossible for the infantry to see through the trees, impossible for the tank to pivot before the shot landed. In one after-action report from the 22nd Infantry Regiment, a lieutenant wrote that his platoon lost 3 tanks in 15 minutes because they never saw even a sleeve of Feldgrau. The forest swallowed the enemy. The enemy fired. Then the forest swallowed them again. American infantrymen began describing these fights not as ambushes, but as executions, moments where the tank never stood a chance. They also realized something far more unsettling. Once the Panzerfaust was fired, the Germans did not stay to fight. They vanished, falling back through pre-cut escape routes, crawling into spider holes, or slipping deeper into the undergrowth. The ambush was not a battle. It was a system, a machine built on invisibility, timing, and ruthless discipline. And the Panzerfaust was the lever that made the machine operate. American units that had trained for engagements at 100 yards now found themselves dragged into 20-yard firefights they did not initiate and could not control. Infantry squads attempting to clear houses in Aachen discovered that Germans often waited until they were inside the entryway to attack. In Hurtgen, platoons advanced across seemingly empty ridgelines only to be hit from 3 angles by weapons fired at distances where even a helmet's curve could be mistaken for a rock. What unnerved the Americans most was the certainty with which the Germans dictated the range. Not one battle in these early phases happened at medium distance. Every engagement collapsed immediately into close quarters, as though the Wehrmacht had tightened a noose around the battlefield itself. The Panzerfaust was not just a weapon, it was a force equalizer. It allowed a single German soldier, hidden and patient, to destroy a 30-ton tank worth a dozen men and thousands of dollars of steel. It allowed the Wehrmacht to bleed the Americans slowly, methodically, without ever offering a target in return. And it forced the U.S. Army into a realization it could no longer ignore. The old rules of combat did not apply in Germany. They would have to learn to fight differently, to shrink their tactics, tighten their formations, and accept that every yard forward might be a fight to the death. By the winter of 1944, that lesson would become undeniable, and the Americans would have to confront a truth no training manual had prepared them for. To defeat an invisible enemy, they would have to learn to fight at distances where the enemy could be smelled before he was seen. By November 1944, the Americans finally understood they were fighting a different kind of war, one that shrank the battlefield until it fit inside a single ruined room, a shell crater, or the space between 2 trees. The realization came slowly, painfully, paid for at Aachen and Hurtgen in platoons shattered by enemies they never saw. Officers who once lectured on 50-yard intervals between squads now found themselves whispering orders like a new catechism: 5 meters, no farther. Veterans began teaching replacements not to look into the distance, but to study the ground directly in front of their boots. A German soldier could hide under a pile of pine branches so skillfully that only a boot print or a disturbed patch of snow betrayed him. A machine gun nest might lie 3 steps off a trail, utterly invisible until the barrels opened fire at 10 meters. The battlefield had collapsed inward, and the Americans were being crushed in that collapse. The transformation in their thinking began at Aachen, where the 26th Infantry Regiment learned that entering a house through the front door was suicide. German defenders, dressed in feldgrau that matched the ash-colored rubble, waited in stairwells and darkened kitchens only to strike when the Americans were within arm's reach. The U.S. Army had never before faced urban combat on this scale. The instinct was to search a building room by room, but in Aachen, room by room meant stepping into range of a Panzerfaust, an MG-42, or even a simple hand grenade dropped from a hole in the ceiling. So, infantry squads adapted the only way they could. They stopped using doors. Engineers blasted holes through the side walls of structures, creating interior corridors that bypassed the kill zones. Assault teams stacked grenades along their belts and practiced clearing spaces by flooding them with fragmentation before a single boot crossed the threshold. And still, it was not enough. In Hurtgen, the battlefield shrank even further. Patrols crawled instead of walked, because standing upright made them visible silhouettes against the winter-gray sky. Platoon leaders advanced only after throwing a grenade over every berm and into every depression. Some units hurled dozens of grenades a day simply to keep unseen German squads off balance. The forest was so dense that contact occurred at ranges close enough for soldiers to smell German tobacco or hear whispered commands in clipped accents. Men began to fight by sound, tracking threats by twigs snapping under boots or the faint scrape of metal on wood. Even artillery, America's great battlefield strength, struggled in this new environment. Shell bursts tore the tops off trees, sending splinters raining down like wooden shrapnel, often injuring the very men they were meant to protect. This forced infantry to move in small rushes of 3 to 5 meters, then hit the ground and wait, listening for clues about where the enemy might be hiding. Veterans later described Hurtgen as a place where you could die without ever seeing the person who killed you. The shrinking battlefield forced the Americans to unlearn the fundamentals they had brought from Normandy. Spread-out formations only helped Germans isolate and destroy them one by one.
Slow, deliberate advances gave Panzerfaust teams the time they needed to reposition. The traditional march under fire doctrine collapsed when fire arrived not from a distant ridge, but from beneath a pile of logs at arm's reach. Slowly, painfully, the Americans rewrote the rules. Squads compressed until soldiers could touch the man in front of them. Sherman tanks advanced with infantry hugging their hulls so closely the treads kicked mud over their helmets. Riflemen fired into every suspicious shadow, ditch, stump, or clump of snow, no longer waiting for visual confirmation of an enemy. At times, they advanced with bayonets fixed simply because combat was happening so close that a rifle's length mattered more than its sights. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers stopped trusting their own eyes. Sleep-deprived and cold, they reported phantoms in the trees, shapes that weren't shapes, colors that didn't belong. A rustling branch could be wind or death. A snowdrift could hide a German in a white smock staring straight at them. But amidst this misery and terror, the Americans finally began to understand the enemy's logic. The Germans wanted zero-distance battles. They wanted ambushes where a Panzerfaust fired at 10 meters, where an MG-42 chewed through snow from a hole invisible until the last moment, where the Americans could not bring their superior artillery and armor to bear. If the Wehrmacht could drag the fight into these tight spaces, experience, not numbers, would decide the outcome. And for weeks, that strategy worked. But the Americans were learning. They were stripping away every habit that no longer served them, reducing their tactics to raw survival and brutal efficiency. They were not yet winning, but they were no longer dying for the same reasons. The battlefield had shrunk. Now the Americans were shrinking with it.
By December 1944, the U.S. Army no longer fought the way it had in Normandy or even Aachen. Every regiment that had passed through the Ruhr frontier or the Hirchen forest had come out changed, bloodied, hardened, and furious at the unseen enemy that seemed to control every inch of terrain. What emerged from this crucible was not a random collection of lessons learned through misery, but a systematic transformation of how Americans waged close combat. The first change came from the infantry themselves. Platoons that once advanced in long skirmish lines now moved as compact assault teams built around a simple idea: whoever established fire superiority first lived. Bar gunners were elevated from support roles to spearheads, firing short, violent bursts into likely hiding spots long before German defenders could ready their weapons. Riflemen moved in bounds so tight they could grab each other's jackets. Every hedge, log pile, cellar gore, and collapsed wall received automatic fire before anyone approached it. Grenades became the default solution to uncertainty. At Aachen, assault squads burned through entire crates of fragmentation grenades each day, throwing them into stairwells, behind furniture barricades, into crawl spaces, even between roof tiles. The goal was not finesse, it was denial. If a space existed, it was a threat. If it was a threat, it was destroyed. Engineers stepped into a new role that would define American urban warfare for decades to come. Instead of following infantry, they led them, carrying satchel charges, pole charges, blowtorches, and coils of TNT fuse. They did not attack doors, they removed walls. Patton had once said that fixed fortifications were monuments to human stupidity. In Aachen, engineers turned entire city blocks into proof of his point. They blasted through adjoining buildings to create mouse holes, interior corridors that let infantry bypass the streets where Panzerfaust teams waited. Soon, American troops were clearing German strongpoints not horizontally, but vertically, blowing through ceilings, descending staircases with flamethrowers, sending shockwaves of noise and heat through structures the Wehrmacht had believed invulnerable. Flamethrowers, once specialist weapons, became indispensable. In Hirchen, their jets of fire flushed Germans from bunkers carved beneath tree roots, revealing firing slits that scouts had walked past dozens of times without seeing. In Aachen, the same weapons sent Panzerfaust teams fleeing from attics and concealed upper floors. U.S. commanders noted that nothing disrupted German camouflage discipline faster than the threat of flame. One battalion commander wrote that fire burned the invisibility out of them. Artillery, the backbone of the American army, also evolved. Forward observers pushed dangerously close to the front,
sometimes crawling within 20 meters of German positions to call for barrages that landed almost on top of friendly troops. The doctrine of time on target, multiple batteries firing so shells arrived simultaneously, became a decisive tool for breaking ambush zones before infantry entered them. In the forest where spotting was nearly impossible, Americans used tree bursts intentionally, setting fuses to explode high enough to rain splinters downward into German foxholes. It was messy, imperfect, and terrifying, but it robbed the Germans of the concealment that had shielded them for months. Meanwhile, tank infantry coordination underwent a revolution. After losing dozens of Shermans to Panzerfausts fired from 20 meters, crews no longer advanced without infantry physically touching the tank's hull. Riflemen pressed their shoulders to the armor, using the tank as moving cover. Tank commanders crouched low in their hatches, relying on infantry eyes to spot threats. This marriage was uncomfortable. Infantry hated the noise, heat, and visibility of tank movement. Tankers hated the vulnerability of having men so close. But together, they neutralized the ambush tactics that had dominated Hürtgen and Aachen. Once separated, they died. Together, they survived. Perhaps the greatest change came in how American soldiers thought about the enemy. Early in the campaign, they had tried to find Germans. By winter 1944, they stopped trying. Instead, they assumed Germans were everywhere unless proven otherwise. This shift from seeking confirmation to assuming presence reshaped doctrine. Patrols opened fire not when they saw a target, but when they sensed one. Silence became as meaningful as noise. If a forest ridge was quiet for too long, artillery hit it. If a window looked too dark, a bazooka round shattered it. The Americans began erasing potential ambushes before they existed. It was brutal, relentless, and for many psychologically scarring. But it worked. By the time the front rolled toward the Ruhr River, something remarkable had happened. The Wehrmacht had lost control of engagement distance. Their carefully prepared 20-meter ambushes failed because American infantry no longer enter kill zones unprepared. Panzerfaust teams died before they could fire. Camouflage nets were shredded by preemptive grenades. Log bunkers that once held out for hours collapsed under coordinated engineer artillery assaults executed within minutes. The Germans had forced the Americans to rewrite the rules of combat. But in doing so, they created the very army that would break them.
By January 1945, the Americans advancing toward the Ruhr and the Rhine bore almost no resemblance to the force that had staggered through Hürtgen or bled in the alleys of Aachen. They no longer feared the invisible enemy in white smocks or Feldgrau. They expected him, they hunted him, and now, crucially, they controlled the range of combat. The shift became unmistakable in the final push toward the Ruhr River dams. Patrols that once crept anxiously through trees now moved with a feral alertness, bounding forward in 5-10-meter rushes, rifles raised not at distant ridges, but at the darkness between trunks, the cracks in rubble, and the slits in German bunkers. Grenadiers waiting with Panzerfausts in cellar windows found themselves smothered by bursts of BAR fire and fragmentation grenades before they could lift their sights. The same American infantry that had once died in cleanly arranged German ambushes now attacked every potential hide site as though it were already occupied. A log pile received a grenade, a snow mound received a burst, a dark window received a bazooka. Caution had been replaced by controlled aggression. The Americans had stopped reacting to ambushes, they were preempting them. Nowhere was this clearer than in the fighting for the villages that dotted the Ruhr Plain. At places like Kleinhau, Bergstein, and Schmidt, American assault teams used techniques refined at Aachen, mouse-holing through walls, clearing buildings floor by floor with grenades and flamethrowers, and coordinating tanks so closely with infantry that a Sherman sometimes fired at walls 10 feet away to blast open new entry points. German defenders who once relied on camouflage and surprise found their positions shredded before they could even reveal themselves. Engineers no longer followed infantry, they were integrated directly into the assault, collapsing bunkers with TNT satchel charges, while riflemen formed a security ring around them. Flamethrower operators moved like executioners, clearing root bunkers and undercuts that had caused so many American casualties in the forest. The very tactics that once made the Germans invisible now became liabilities. Any unnatural mound of earth, any perfect line of branches, any oddly shaped shadow was singled out and destroyed. American artillery, too, had evolved into a precise and terrifying instrument. Time-on-target barrages fell with mathematical synchronization, wiping out German strongpoints before infantry arrived. Forward observers, their confidence hardened by months of crawling within sight of German posts, now called fire missions measured in yards, sometimes landing shells so close that shrapnel hissed over their heads. Artillery no longer merely softened positions, it denied the Germans the ability to regroup for counterattacks. Even the dreaded Panzerfaust, the nightmare of Aachen, lost much of its sting. Infantry clung to Sherman tanks like armor-plated shadows, spotting firing ports and Panzerfaust teams before they could deploy. Tanks in turn blasted suspected hideouts with canister or high-explosive shells at point-blank range. The range of German ambushes, 20 to 30 meters, no longer existed as a tactical envelope. American fire forced the fight outward or crushed it inward before it began. As the Americans pushed across the Ruhr and into the Rhineland, entire German platoons surrendered rather than attempt close-range defense. They reported that U.S. infantry advanced too fast and too violently, stripping away concealment and cover before defenders could even prepare their shot. One German officer captured near Linux stated bluntly, "The Americans now fight like hunters. You have taken the forest from us." By March 1945, as U.S. forces approached the Rhine, the enemy that had once been invisible had finally become exposed. At Remagen, where American forces seized the Ludendorff Bridge almost intact, the speed of the U.S. advance demonstrated how completely they had mastered the close-range war. Infantry stormed the bridge under artillery fire. Engineers swarmed forward to cut demolition wires. Tanks rumbled across despite the risk of Panzerfausts hiding among the abutments. But the ambushers never materialized, not because German troops lacked courage, but because the Americans no longer allowed ambush zones to form. The ability to dictate distance meant the Americans could finally fight on their own terms. And once they did, the Wehrmacht's defensive system, built on camouflage, discipline, and perfectly timed shock, began to fracture. The transformation that had begun in the forests of Hürtgen reached its conclusion on the Rhine's western bank. A U.S. army that once stumbled blindly through darkened trees now advanced with methodical brutality, rendering German invisibility obsolete. The soldiers who crossed the Rhine in March 1945 carried their rifles low and their eyes high, no longer searching for ghosts but eliminating the places where ghosts could hide. In 6 brutal months, they had rewritten the close-quarters doctrine of a modern army. The Germans had forced them to learn war measured in meters. The Americans had mastered it, and in doing so, helped bring the Third Reich to its final collapse.